Good morning. Welcome to the Policy Insights Forum in our Strategic Perspectives series. Today's event is entitled Building National Information Resilience Against Influence Attacks. Our special guest today is Mr. Michael Berk. I'm Paul Taillon, and I am the chair of the Policy Insights Forum and the president and CEO of Samuel Associates Policy Insights, or the PIF. The PIF is a nonpartisan research division of Samuel Associates. The forum helps improve policy and decision-making through independent research, analysis, and engagement. Samuel Associates is a trusted advisor to many influential businesses and leaders. We work with the clients in the aerospace, defense, national security, and cyberspace industries, providing market, advisory services, and governmental relations. Today's event is brought to you by Samuel Associates. We hope you enjoy the session and encourage you to participate. Today's event will explore the following key topic: building national information resilience against influence attacks. Before we begin, I would like to thank industry and association executives, government officials from Canada and the United States, NATO members in Europe, and foreign government representatives participating in today's events. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the forum. To discuss this important topic, we are fortunate to have today Mr. Michael Berk, the President and CEO of Alton Corporation and Chief Operating Officer, the ALRM Group Incorporated, whose core business is the provision of capacity building and institutional reform services across the defense and security sectors globally. With a background in military and security operations, Mr. Berk brings over 20 years of experience focusing on information operations, cybersecurity, critical infrastructure protection, international security, and Eurasian politics. Mr. Berk holds a master's degree in political science from York University and has published widely on lawful intercepts, cybercrime, insider threat detection, as well as op-eds on international security issues. From 1995 to 2001, he was a part of the Israeli security infrastructure. He worked in varying degrees at the Ben Gurion Airport and for El Al, Israel's airlines in Europe and Asia. He ended his engagement as the El Al Assistant Chief of Security in Canada. Between 2001 and 2008, he was Director and Research Fellow with the Canadian Institute of International Affairs, Canadian International Council, focusing on foreign and defense policies and Eurasian affairs. Since 2016, Mr. Berk has been a member of the OSCE Advisory Working Group on confidence building measures in cyberspace and a research fellow with the Center for Cybersecurity and International Relations at the University of Florence in Italy. His expertise focuses on behavior in cyberspace and critical infrastructure protection and has made him and his firm in high demand. We look forward to an informative session on this critical issue. I would ask Mr. Berk to take the floor to provide his overview. Mr. Berk, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, Goran, and Paul, and Samuel Associates for this opportunity. And I'm looking forward, and thank you, of course, to all the participants today. I hope this will be an engaging conversation, and I'm looking forward to this opportunity to share my thoughts with you and to discuss what challenges we face in information space and what can be done about it. Two caveats before I start my presentation. The first is that I think, given the complexity of the topic we're going to discuss, there will be less emphasis on practical solutions and more on sort of theory and conceptual understanding of problems that we face. And a second caveat is that I suspect that some of you have come to this presentation from cyber world, and to you, information security, information resilience, and this topic mean slightly different things. So just to emphasize the point that when I be talking about information and influence today, I mainly refer to activities that are aimed to change behavior or cognition in opponents, so something that we call influence operations. So I hope you bear with me. So despite the crossovers that exist between cyber and influence activities, there's still some significant differences. So let me start the presentation. And thank you, Paul, for a very kind introduction to my background. Few words specifically focusing on experiences and projects that we've done on these topics, because just to demonstrate sort of where our understanding and knowledge and recommendations that we develop sometimes come from. As Paul mentioned, I started my career with IDF in the early 90s. Most of my service was in South Lebanon, where I was engaged in various jobs, but including CIMIC and PSYOPs, among others. And I went on from there to work on critical infrastructure protections, as Paul mentioned, counterterrorism, and eventually international security and cyber policy development over the years, which took me across different countries and allowed me this exposure to very breadth of topics and challenges and issues facing many countries on these issues. I completed my kind of full circle coming back to influence research and policy development around 2014, working closely with my partner and colleague, Alicia Wanless, who since then actually went on to establish a partnership for countering influence operations at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. in 2019. Jointly, we have done a lot of research online, and also trying to analyze various connections and relations that exist between actors, behaviors, and when possible, effects on the ground. So I'm not going to list all the things we've done, but in addition to coming up describing a concept of participatory propaganda, which some of you may have come across, and what can be done to counter some of those activities. In addition, I had experiences on cyber policy development in 2015, 2016. Again, as Paul mentioned, I worked with the OEC Cyber Office, and one of the interesting experience recently has been leading a team of cyber and information environment analysts to the Ukrainian presidential and parliamentary elections in 2019, which gave me a very good ground level exposure to what's happening in this country, but also overall in information space inside Ukraine and around it. And recently, I've been working with Wikimedia Foundation rather, to help them to develop strategies for countering influence activities on wiki platforms projects around 2020 presidential elections in the US and going forward. So with this, let's move on to the main issue. I would like to start by laying some of the sort of basic concepts, I guess, so that we can maybe look at these issues jointly. And as I said, my main focus is going to be on sort of conceptual theoretical aspects, although I will come later on to describe and discuss some of the practical solutions and practical steps that have to be taken by Canada and the international community in order to address some of these challenges. So in the next few slides, I will talk about the information environment, challenges that facing nation states and specific problems on the road to developing a more comprehensive view of information environment and possible solutions. As many of you know, the exponentially increasing speed and volume of information due to improvements in computational power and ICTs creates a rapidly changing operating environment for governments, militaries, activists, and numerous societal actors. Like the physical environment, the information environment surrounds us, and we're an inextricable part of it. Often the information environment is understood as a sum of its parts. So it's all the infrastructure and devices, all the content and messages, a means of communication such as TV, internet, social media, opinions expressed and knowledge shared, But in our view, information environment is much more than objects, infrastructure, or content streaming through it. The essence of the information environment comes not from its technological, or biological, or cognitive elements, but from the interactions between them. And as it stands today, due to the extreme complexity and interwoven dynamics inherent to this environment, we really don't know how this environment operates, how the information flows. And I don't mean, again, networks and cyber systems, because and we hear a lot about Russia and China, two international actors who actively engage in influence and information operations. But the reality is that all countries, especially those with enough resources and interests that extend beyond their borders, engage in these activities under various guises and in various. In this struggle include the official entities, such as governments, military, and diplomatic entities of your country, so Canada in our case, or the opponent country, or wherever it is, as well as country or countries where the operation takes place, and any relevant allied countries who may have some interest about that theater of operations or about a particular issue. It also involves the unofficial or dependent entities that are used by official entities to operate under the threshold of open conflict or international law, and thus, in theory, influence debate, and these are state media, proxy organizations, criminal groups, and some think tanks, among others. And then we also have independent entities, which consist of all others within the information space broadly, and in particular time and space, an issue at hand. So the multitude of technological tools and digitization of information afford various entities, adversaries, and competitors the ability to operate hence the gray zone and with greater depth and reach. The range of actors involved, as well as strategies and tactics available to them, is quite broad, often inexpensive, and definitely accessible. So against this background, we notice a number of significant trends that disrupt traditional approaches to national security governance, again, speaking from the influence and information environment perspective. This include the traditional separation of foreign versus domestic cannot be fully applied to information space, especially in liberal democratic countries. Of course, there's a lot more that can be said about it, and I hope maybe during the Q&A we'll have a chance to discuss or address some of these issues in more detail. Next is a traditional separation of offensive versus defensive in influence operations, such as targeted distribution of influence content. It also no longer applies. Strategic and tactical levels converge, with one strongly affecting the other. Next is industrial age institutional silos and decision-making processes are inadequate in the face of evolving challenges, and in some countries are already rapidly losing public trust. And then there is also the growing demand for clearly articulated vision, a new storyline, if you will, to explain the rapidly changing reality and provide meaning to individual experiences. Personally, I believe the last point is the most salient, and if all of these points are important, of course, but the last one is important because countries in which political elites and societies cannot agree on a common direction, which also presupposes a degree of shared worldview, will not be able to effectively mobilize, organize, and channel resources at their disposal toward the common good, however it is defined in each society. In some parts of the world, such as Scandinavian countries, the so-called Global South, but also recently at United Nations level and the World Bank, for example, there's already a growing talk about and voices calling for a new social contract aimed at achieving a more equitable distribution of power and economic benefits, which also supposed to drive increased citizen engagement in political affairs of the state, and consequently stronger buy-in with this shared worldview, and as a result, increasing resilience against malicious influences, be it extremist philosophies or some adversary powers. When you consider these challenges separately and together, and what they mean for existing institutional, organizational, strategic, technological, regulatory, and governance models that we currently have, I think you would agree that we really don't know how the information environment works and how to make sense of this overwhelming flood of information thrown at us by media, other states, and so on and so forth. If we consider the information environment as a network or system, social media companies are like a muscle tissue, tying body joints together and making our limbs move. They're a major point of intervention for addressing threats to the information environment. Social media companies also hold key to the understanding of how information environment works as a system, what the effects of influence operations are on people and societies, and which interventions work to counter things like disinformation. Currently, however, we have major gaps in knowledge in all of these areas. Excuse me. First, we understand very little about how the information works as a system, how information flows between different online platforms through influencers into the medium, and then how it spreads and gets amplified by individuals, groups, activists, and all other entities that I mentioned earlier. While since 2016, so the previous US elections in particular, platforms increased their activities to counter or reduce malicious behaviors online. We don't really know if these takedowns, as they're called, have effect in the long run. Platforms almost never disclose details of their inner operations, let alone information that sheds light on how the algorithms contribute to some of the adverse behaviors we observe, or maybe help to mitigate against them. Second is, despite a lot of talk and coverage, there's very little knowledge about the effects of influence operations and disinformation on individuals and groups. The majority of academic research has focused on traditional mass media, and studies on the role of social media mostly focus on limited case studies and short-term effects. In many of these case studies, the available evidence points more to correlations rather than causations of effects. What we need right now, longitudinal studies and meta-studies to make sense of available data, and this can only be done through collaboration of industry, researchers, and regulators. Third point is that research on the efficacy of the main countermeasures that have been considered or implemented in some countries for addressing problems like disinformation is also lacking. While there's a large academic literature on fact-checking as one of those countermeasures, almost no one has studied the most important countermeasures enacted by social media companies, such as removing prominent bad actors from those platforms. While social media platforms have already introduced some new policies and experimented with various interventions to counter influence operations, there is next to no publicly information on whether these measures actually work. This also, however, applies to many government and military-led initiatives in this field. There are serious shortcomings with measurements and evaluations in this area, and yet most of these entities continue to advocate for more action and adopt policies to deal with these problems. The result of these three challenges is that we don't have tangible data that could inform policy development and prioritize our focus on solutions that work. Instead, governments often rely on poorly informed media, limited research, as mentioned already, lobby groups, sometimes on tactics and solutions adopted for military use in operations abroad. None of these are conducive to developing balanced and informed policies by liberal democracies in the information age. Despite the situation, countries rush to propose and adopt legislations governing the information space. According to the research conducted by Princeton University in collaboration with the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations at Carnegie, since 2015, over 174 pieces of legislation have been introduced in countries worldwide to counter influence operations, disinformation, fake news, and other unwanted malicious behaviors online. In addition, the project counted over 450 initiatives introduced worldwide to address these issues through civic engagement, regulations, policy development, and research. Of those, about 44% of those 450 initiatives occur in North America, 37% in Europe, and also out of the 400, only 5% are government-sponsored initiatives, which is striking because the general expectation is that governments should lead these efforts. So due to lacking systemic views of the challenges, nobody's conducting longer-term measurement efforts to accurately assess the longitudinal trends, develop and track effective solutions, and build longer-term frameworks ensuring the preservation of liberal and democratic values. So despite the apparent cost to democratic societies and potential risks stemming from largely uninformed policymaking, we still do not see the required political leadership to prioritize concerted efforts aiming at closing the systemic gaps between research, policy, and practice. So, moving quite rapidly through this topic, what can be done? As a first step, we believe that social media platforms must be compelled to share unique data they possess to allow qualified researchers deploy research methods, relevant theories, and especially bring their independence to assess data in the context of specific social, political, and other policy needs. Government regulators and political decision makers have to be involved as well, of course, as part of a comprehensive system where data and analysis would feed into policy development. Work that spans these groups is critical to answering important questions about governing and addressing challenges in the information environment, such as how to effectively counter malign influence operations. As part of this process, work by creating the relevant infrastructure and conducive and collaborative working environment for studying the information environment. One such concept has already emerged, modeled after the European Organization for Nuclear Research, known to many of us as CERN, the birthplace of the World Wide Web and the home of the Hadron Collider. With 23 member states, this research organization conducts fundamental research in physics of energy and matter. If we consider the magnitude of challenges facing the world in the rapidly evolving information age, I think many of you would agree that such idea or definitely merits a close examination due to the scale of problems and the fact that this problem is of course not limited just to any individual country, but many of these issues are shared and problems and difficulties are shared across borders. Canada does have a history of investing in information and innovation research. For example, the New Frontiers and Research Fund has committed over 200, almost $300 million to fund international, interdisciplinary, fast-breaking, and high-risk research. And Canadian Heritage is also currently has funds research to better understand the impact of disinformation and the efficacy of countermeasures, but on a much smaller scale of about $100,000 per project. So there's a possibility that maybe with a coordinated approach to this issue, it might be possible to pool funds from within the country, within Canada, to address specific contextual problems that we face here, but also to sponsor collaboration between allied countries and beyond to address this global problem. Third, in addition to infrastructure and data sharing, Canada and other nations interested in developing societal resilience must consider related issues from a systemic perspective. In our view, this requires the development of a truly strategic vision, which must articulate what and where Canada wants to be by, for example, 2050. This needs to be done by providing meaning for a host of social, economic, and political issues facing Canadians in this evolving information age. It is a tall order, no doubt, for any society to generate such a vision, let alone assemble political courage, popular will, and adequate allocation of resources to move in this direction. Due to the sheer scale and complexity, we can think of that the challenges we face currently in information environment would be akin to what FDR proposed with the New Deal in 1930s, and the consequences it meant for society, American society at the time. However, when looked from the point of view of issues and challenges we covered so far, including building a society that is more resilient to, there's no doubt in my mind that a modern society that manages to articulate such a vision will also succeed in mobilizing its citizens around commonly shared values, goals, and aspirations based on democratic principles, enhance our resistance to malicious influence. Again, it is a system, so different elements of this systems have to be considered holistically, and the approach to solutions has to, of course, be holistic as well. In this process, such a society would also determine what actions at home and abroad are legitimate and which are not. To ensure the rule of law persists and norms of behavior the society considers beneficial for advancing the vision forward are sufficiently reinforced. Lastly, this process would also necessitate new rules of engagement governing the relations between individuals, groups, and states in times of peace and in times of conflict. I think many of us would agree that currently it seems that the world is sliding further down the rabbit hole to a more chaotic and unpredictable existence. If states and societies find in themselves the necessary drives to move along this difficult path, I believe we will acquire the necessary knowledge, tools, and mechanisms to become more resilient in the face of many challenges facing us along this difficult path, while preserving our democratic values and principles. The alternative, I'm afraid, seems quite bleak, but I will stop here before I spoil you down. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. First question that came up: how likely is it that we can establish international infrastructure and collaborative anything in an era of great power competition? And secondly, are regional like-minded groupings more likely?
So yes, I think definitely regional groupings are definitely more likely, simply because the path that we face is quite arduous, and it's only natural that we start on this path together with our allies and partners in different countries, different degrees of collaboration that we have with them. However, it is inescapable that we'll have to deal with our competitors as well, because the more we study this environment, the more we study how influence operations actually work and the effects they sometimes have on people. So it's inevitable that we have to come to terms on how to deal with this activity. So let's say operations, also with our competitors, so Russia, China, Iran, and others, because the information environment we share, it's no longer national, it's a global one. So the concerns, the challenges, the problems that we face, and let's say Russia faces, are quite similar to some extent. So there has to be, I was talking about rules of engagement. We do have to develop those rules of engagement with our competitors and adversaries.
Michael, in your view, is the human cognitive domain now a legitimate domain of warfare, along with the other five, in which influence and information operations are conducted?
Well, legitimate, no, because it is there's no law that that regulates or allows for such activities to take place. In fact, the laws that we have currently internationally, in fact, well, they don't. Nobody talks about cognitive security, but what they do address are preservation of human dignity, preservation of human individual ability to form opinions and decisions and so on. And also, of course, we have the laws that deal with sovereignty, national sovereignty, and principles of non-intervention. So we have that. However, at the same time, as all of us know, I mean, there's nothing really new in what we see today, except, of course, the speed, the volume, and the reach of these malicious communications. People have always been influenced one another since the dawn of his human history. So in this sense, we simply have to adapt to this new reality and develop rules allowing us, or not allowing it, but rules that formulate the engagements that are legitimate versus the illegitimate ones.
Question, more definitional in approach. This writer basically says, I define misinformation as mistakes about the truth, disinformation as lies about the truth. Is not misinformation a greater problem than disinformation? Or does a small bit of disinformation go in a much longer way?
Right. Okay. Thank you. So there's a very charged word used in this question, of course, and that charged word is truth. What is truth? Is universal truth? Does it exist? Do we all share, and by all I mean not just here in Canada, for example, but globally, do we all share a particular shared vision? Of course, we don't. I mean, take two people, and two people will have five opinions probably on what they see and what their real life experiences have been, and it's going to be very difficult to match between those. So in a way, misinformation is more problematic, yes, because it's much easier for people to share this this content, this messaging, without understanding what's behind or by mistake. And of course, it happens on a much broader scale in our societies. And this should be addressed through education and awareness and various programs that governments or groups and societies adopt to deal with these issues. Disinformation, because of the inherent intent, can be dealt with in some ways if we can identify actors behind them and explain or understand what motivations drive them to do that. Then we might be able to correct those issues through proactive communications or through public diplomacy or through other methods available to us.
Michael, could you elaborate on the importance and how we may conceptualize information resilience by liberal democracies as a strategic priority?
Well, I mean, I think the discussion, I guess, or this conversation, in my mind, should start with very basic questions. Do we know what we want to protect? Do we have do we understand what resilience to influence operations, influence attacks actually means? Do we have the stamina? Do we have the resources, and so on and so forth? If we determine that information resilience is a strategic issue of strategic importance to Canada or any other country, then we can start putting together mechanisms and policies and processes to address this. I mean, what is resilience with regards to information space and information attacks? Its ability to withstand and how people are trying to come up with the definition here. Its ability to withstand a massive or a significant impact, and then resist and recover. And if and that includes, of course, in the cognitive domain, it includes, of course, our knowledge and our values and our principles, which we here in Canada at least view very highly. So democratic principles. So in order to protect those principles, we need to develop the shared articulation of what those principles are, what are the values that we share, all of us as a society. And so once we can agree on at least the basic grouping of those values, then we could start approaching the development of policies and mechanisms.
You noted in your presentation that industrial age institutional silos and their inherent decision-making processes are inadequate in the face of evolving challenges. How can we address this situation effectively?
So apart from, it's a great question. It's a very complex issue, of course. So apart from the shared understanding, which of course, again, it's a prerequisite for anything in this field. If we don't share conceptually, theoretically, some worldview to some extent, then of course we won't be able to agree on definitions. We won't be able to agree on the priorities, and then as a result, everything else. So the industrial age processes in silos have been developed for a particular economic and political model. With information age and with increasing online presence of everybody and the flow of information, we need to come up with a different model of coordinating our activities, coordinating our plans, share information between, as I mentioned earlier, platforms or communication companies that work in this field, regulators and researchers, and of course civil society, so that information is shared. There is a better understanding of issues involved. There is a more common understanding that's developing, and that is going to drive forward, again, as I repeat myself already, drive forward the development of new processes. In a way, we need to empower people to be able to make decisions and to be able to operate in this environment. So when we talk about silos and how to sort of redefine these processes and procedures, we have to start from the very beginning, which is kindergarten.
Well, along that lines, given the need for popular agreement on shared visions for effective resilience, do authoritarian regimes enjoy an advantage here? And can democracies gel sufficiently for true resilience?
Yes, well, naturally, if we think about information environment as a system in which interconnected at some level, and there's let's say a glue that brings different elements of that system together, and by glue we mean either it's a 5-year plan, for example, like in good old days in Soviet Union, or some directive that is coming down from a central authority of some kind. So countries like Russia and China, we know the history, have been working on honing this model for decades. I mean, this is part of their, one could say, part of their cultural and historic experience. Of course, here in Canada and Western world, it's a different story. We are, as societies emerged and rose more sort of where we are sum of different parts, and we have to constantly find ways of collaborating, sharing values, and trying to come to common understanding. And this is also required right now. It's going to be more difficult for us, there's no doubt, because we're not accustomed to operate as we don't have, I think, in many countries in the West, we no longer have a glue that connects us. So the options that we have seen maybe in the last 20 years, let's say, there's some policies that came from some of the governments that are driven sometimes more by fear rather than a coherent and proactive articulation of future objectives that we need to reach. And then, of course, then what I mentioned earlier, the mobilization, legitimization of why we do things the way we do them. What is the point behind mobilizing ourselves as a society towards what objective, and so on.
Michael, in your presentation, you noted that legacy separation of foreign versus domestic cannot be applied in the information environment in liberal democratic countries. Could you expand on this issue?
Yes, thank you for this question. It is an important one. The simple answer is that in this day and age, information flows across borders. If we, we see, I mean, we work with militaries and we see how there is almost like an ingrained desire sometimes to adopt methods and tactics used by militaries in some remote theater of operation, let's say Afghanistan, Iraq, it doesn't matter, and apply and use those methods to apply them at home. So of course, there's many restrictions and difficulties with that. But on the flow of information, I just want to bring one example from not too distant history that we, I think, remember, and that's the case of United States advocating for the war in Iraq in early 2000s, and how that process worked. So the mechanisms created, the processes put in place by the Bush administration at the time, and the messaging that they used to advocate for military intervention abroad, how a lot of it came back and was used, in fact, on purpose to influence domestic audiences at home to mobilize the country for this war effort. But as we discovered afterwards, it was based on erroneous intelligence or fabricated as well. So the problem is that we find its way back home and will influence people here.
You noted in your presentation, Michael, that the biggest challenge is that we do not understand how the information environment works. How do we address this strategic lack of understanding amongst government?
Yes, if I had the answer to that, so I think, well, I think the answer is quite obvious. In fact, and I will already refer to some of the steps that we as Canada, or we as international community of allies and like-minded countries could take, and that is to sponsor a more data-driven research. First of all, we need to understand what is going on, how this information flows, how it flows across platforms, how it flows across borders, how it affects people. Some very often, what we've seen, claims about effect of some influence operation is used to inflame hysteria sometimes, and then it then goes to politicians who introduce some laws or use other instruments to try to regulate the space, but it's all done in a piecemeal approach. So as research, it's more data, but data that, and this research must be driven by policy needs. So we need to articulate conceptual. So I would just briefly, so data-based research, coordination, collaboration, but more importantly, above all, is we need that strategic vision.
This is a follow-on question and from the audience. I am struck by the fact that this field of endeavor again calls upon significant leadership requirements. Where will our future elected leaders learn all this stuff? Will they ever master it?
Yes, indeed. That is the question. I mean, for those of, I mean, I assume many of you have come to this this discussion from cyber world. So at least to me, when I was working on cyber policy development in some with some organizations and countries, what we currently experience, or where we are currently on the topic of influence, operation, disinformation, and what can be done about it, to me, it resonates with where we have been as a global community, maybe about 25, 30 years. So that's where we are currently on this topic, on these issues. And those of us, again, dealt with international cyber policy and cyber governance, we've seen how over the last 30 years, but since basically, United Nations group of governmental experts set up in early 2000s, demonstrated how slow and how painful often this process was. So we are really just at the start of it. And as the West in particular, the Western countries. So our adversaries or competitors, definitely, as I mentioned already, have advanced faster and further. So we are now playing catch up. But this is something, again, we need to do if we collectively decide that this is, it's worth our time.
A more local question. All politics are local, what roles do municipalities play?
Interesting question. Okay, I did not consider a role for municipalities as such in this big scheme of things. Of course, as elements of local governance, and depending on resources they have and the understanding of these issues, they might be part of a national system of literacy, media literacy, or online literacy, if they can organize and promote events or training programs. This would be also advisable and very useful. However, as already implied in this conversation, the real effect of on these issues will happen only if we in Canada come together in a holistic manner. So all levels of government, civil society, relevant organizations, researchers, and so on, who are part of the same mechanism, as opposed to individual cogs in a machine acting kind of independently and without coordination.
This is reference a recent report that was commissioned by the European Parliament and conducted by the Director General for External Policies. Drawing from that document, apart from issuing new legislation on the matter, what can the European Union concretely do to strengthen member states' resilience in the cyber era? Is it in the EU's competency to generate such a strategy, in your opinion?
If there is a desire, then the competencies will be found. There's no doubt. I believe last week, the European Parliament has issued a very interesting, useful report dealing with best practices best practices to enhance resilience against hybrid threats. I believe it's the title. And it's a very comprehensive report that talks specifically about, so it covers very useful topics related to conceptual parts of this problem, and then talks about best practices implemented in particular by Finland, Sweden, and also, in fact, also mentioned Australia as a country where they given the situation they're in and challenges they experience from a neighboring country, they started advancing in this direction. Back to Europe, yes, it is possible. It, in fact, as a coordinating body for all member states in the Union, they do have a very strong role to play about this.
Well, since there are 27 members in the EU and that building a shared EU hybrid threat typology would be more preferable to use the method of a two-speed Europe to implement the strategic thinking within all members of states?
I don't think I'm familiar with the two-speed concept. I'm not sure what it refers to.
Basically, advanced states moving quicker than the rest that are maybe a little lagging.
Okay. Well, again, it depends on. Okay, this topic is so multifaceted and so complex that there's probably space and place for this two-speed approach because if we are talking about, for example, a country in Eastern Europe that has been experiencing a continuous onslaught of Russian disinformation, for example, then relevant to their particular cultural historic context, whether it's Ukraine, Poland, or anybody else, there would be some practical methods or practical instruments that this particular country could develop in order to counter or resist such activities in their own national information space. However, as already implied earlier, the sheer scale and complexity of these problems cannot limit our view, our approach to an individual country. It has to be done collectively. So in this sense, EU, as in Brussels, EU central mechanisms could play a stronger role.
The last question, Michael. China and Russia, as well as criminal hackers, have been extremely aggressive in their cyber hacking operations against various private and public sectors in the United States, Great Britain, and Canada, amongst others. At what point do these potentially critical information invasions transit from information gathering, theft for exploitation, to that of an act of war?
Another $1 million question. And this is why we do need, very urgently, we do need to develop a more comprehensive approach to information space. National information management, if you will, has to become that kind of a program. And then the other, of course, important factor is encourage, sponsor, and engage in the development of international sort of global framework that addresses problems of warfare below the threshold, which includes information warfare, hybrid operations, and all of these activities. Yes, we can, as individual countries, we can come up with certain definitions for deterrence purposes, but it's very difficult to. So in cyber, we can do some of the deterrence, limited, but still. And from influence perspective, because here we're talking already about the entire machinery of government power, resources, and various possibilities that are at the disposal of a nation state.
Thank you on behalf of the Policy Insights Forum for your incisive commentary and responses. This has been a most enlightening session drawing from our commentaries and underlines the complexity of not only developing personal resilience, but the implications economically, socially, and governmentally of not ensuring information resilience at these respective levels. I have no doubt that these sessions will inevitably be a focus for Canada and our allies as we attempt to orchestrate a comprehensive information resilience strategy for the future. To our audience in Canada, the United States, and Europe, thank you for participating in our Strategic Perspectives series. For more information about our upcoming events, please visit at www.policyinsights.ca. Our next event is on Wednesday, May 26, 2021, and we'll speak on the topic of a national security strategy for the Arctic, a US-Canadian view. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.